Thank you for joining us today. My name is Daniel Stillwell. I am the IFTA e-newsletter editor, and I am here today with Dr. William Hiebert, who has been gracious enough to join us to talk to us about some of his thoughts and memories about Dr. Bill Nichols. So, Bill, thank you for joining us. My first broad question is, how did the two of you meet? What was he like back in the day?
Well, I met Bill somewhere between 1972 and 1980.
Broad
And
range.
yeah, yes, Bill was active in AA, American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. And I began sometime in the mid 70s to be what was called the regional news editor for the AAMFT newsletter. And Bill was somewhere in the officer rank of AMFT. I don't exactly know when he was president, but in any case, I became editor in chief of Family Therapy News in 1980. And that was the new name of the old newsletter. And it was the movement out of AMFT being sort of a small association into an association that was really reaching out to people and taking on many members. And so the board thought that the newsletter needed to be upgraded to a more national publication. And so that was the beginning of that process. And I think that Bill had been president. I think he was past president because in somewhere in the early 80s, Don Williamson, who was then president of AMFT, had a long meeting in the bar at the national conference with Carl Whitaker. And Carl Whitaker at that point made the decision that night to join AAMFT. Some of the early founders of family therapy movement were hesitant to join AAMFT and were caught between AAMFT and IFTA. So Whitaker decided to cast his lot with AAMFT. And the next morning, Don Williamson called me into his suite and he said, Bill, Carl Whitaker is going to join AMFT and he's agreed to write for the newsletter. And you are to call him every issue to get his column. And I want his column on the front page. So for 5 years, then I was editor in chief. And when I retired from that role in 1985, Bill Nichols succeeded me. So my relationship to Bill goes back before IFTA. But in the 1990s, both Bill and I became more active in IFTA, and somewhere around 1996, it was at the Akron Congress, that he came up to me and said, I want to hand over the IFTA newsletter to you. And so that began our sort of conversation and relationship around IFTA. So that sort of is how we got started. From then on, it was a series of frequent telephone conversations and meetings with Bill, because along with the regional editor and then functioning with in a different role, Bill was pushing IFTA to take on a more centralized function of the association up until not exactly sure when, approximately late 1990s. The the executive director or general secretary of IFTA was really a sort of volunteer position. And Flora Caslow had been the general secretary for many years, starting with the association in 1987. And then she was succeeded by Terry Trepper, who was both the general secretary and the journal editor for the IFTA Journal.
Mm.
Terry retired from the general secretary in 2006, and that's when I began work as the general secretary. But from 2000 to 2006, the IFTA board was very interested in centralizing the administration of IFTA instead of having volunteer officers scattered around the world and the difficulty with communication and all of that. Bill was sort of the instigator behind the concept that IFTA needed to have a more centralized administrative function and a central administrative office. So that that's sort of, I guess, how I would summarize Bill's work in IFTA. Had a lot to do with, I guess, I would say, shoring up and beginning an association. He was actively involved in writing a constitution, bylaws, code of ethics, all of the things you need to do to get an organization off the ground and flying, so to speak.
Hmm. Yeah, from the writings, it seems like he had a number of hands in a number of organizations for so many years, that it probably was a blessing to have someone like that help, birth IFTA the way that it did.
Well, I think that Bill's talents were really multifaceted. Most people know about all of his scholarly academic editing work, which is probably the part that most people are aware of Bill Nichols.
Yeah, I've got the textbook right behind me.
Right. My role with him really was much more organizational because he had a real gift for organizational structure and how an organization needed to function. And so IFTA began as a grassroots um, association where people in different countries would promote the idea of holding a Congress in their country, and it moved around the world with countries sponsoring the Congress. But that left it very precarious because if a country faltered or went broke in the process of trying to do a Congress, the whole thing fell to the ground. And so it was Bill Nichols' idea, among a few others, Judy Landau and Arnold Bendevam and a few other former presidents, who had a vision that there needed to be a more centralized administrative function and that IFTA needed to be less dependent on the good graces of a variety of countries and more a function as an association in its own
Hmm.
right.
So it sounds like his role at IFTA was very much a type of leader and, um, mentor in some ways. What kind of leader was he?
Well, I think that that depends largely, I think, on who you were. I
Mm,
think that if you were a young person writing an article or a young professional writing an article for a journal, I would think that it came back with a lot of red. And because he was very precise and very articulate, and grammar was important to him. After all, he started as a journalist, so
mm,
he had a background in journalism and editing long before he became a family therapy and psychologist person. So that all of uh, the print media, if I can put it that way, was very important to him. So I think if you came up from that perspective, I think he might have been intimidating, unless you got to know him well, because he certainly uh, seemed like he had eyes in the back of his head, and that it was hard to get a sentence written the way he really liked it. So that's the one perspective. I think people who were organizationally involved with him, people who sat on the AMFT board, would find him always knowing exactly where he thought the association should go, and wasn't hesitant to say that, and was never unclear about what he thought the journey was. So if you disagreed with, let's say, the polity of the vision, I think you would have had to have your idea rather clearly enunciated in order for him to agree that you had a
mhm.
perspective that was worthy of considering. So I think that he was a worthy adversary, if I could put it that way, politically, if you disagreed or challenged his perception. But above all of that was a great deal of caring about the field and a real love of the field and a real determination to defend it. And while most people will probably would say, well, Bill Nichols has strong opinions, I think I would also be very important to say that he was capable of change and taking into account circumstances. So, for example, to put this in sort of down into sort of where the the rubber hits the road, so to speak. For many years, IFTA had shied away from articulating standards for family therapy training. And he was adamantly opposed to any kind of standards for training and supervision. But in the early 2010s, the number of things were happening in a number of countries in which their governments were moving towards some kind of regulation of the mental health field. And they came to IFTA and said, we need some standards. So Bill and a couple of others went to work and created the beginnings of what we today call the International Accreditation Commission for Systemic Therapy Education. And they were entitled, in fact, guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
And they were published. There was a meeting in Holland with representatives from various countries struggling with this issue. And they said very bluntly and straightforwardly, we don't need guidelines, we need standards. And in fact, several people said, we don't even have the word guidelines in our language.
Mm.
And so Bill then said, okay, I guess the cultural context is such that we need to do this.
Yeah.
So he created the standards and the idea that we ought to move to a commission that IFTA that had for years said that it was a interest group and not a standard setting organization and needed to do this, but to maintain IFTA as an interest group, the standards were part of the International Accreditation Commission, not directly part of IFTA. And so that's an example, I think, how Bill's ideas have changed as family therapy began to spread around the world.
Very good. Very good. Thank you very much for giving us some insight into this. Are there any other Bill specific stories that you want to share before we leave?
Well, I guess the other thing I would say about him was that he didn't forget things that might have been talked about and said, oh, we should do this, we should do that. But he would circle back and say, have you gotten that written yet? Have you put that down into writing? He could track, I guess, is the thing. A lot of people have ideas, but they're not very good at tracking.
Sure.
And Bill was always very good at tracking. And I think that his organizational heart, I think in the last 20 years really had moved over to IFTA. He was fascinated with the international aspect of family therapy, learning from people as to what they were doing in other countries, and still always concerned about the quality of education. And so we have today this this sort of double, I guess, tier in the Accreditation Commission, where we have a track for countries that are not ready to move to a more fully evolved therapy training system, and then one for more advanced countries, more advanced programs. And so all of that is a sort of a brainchild of Bill, as he believed that there had to be somewhere people could look to find some guidance in terms of family therapy. Now, IFTA changed dramatically from the time Bill entered, because in 1990, I'm not exactly sure what the membership was, but it was probably around 200. And IFTA was made up of a large group of Americans who were training in Europe at that time. So there was a strong contingent of trainers in the early IFTA organization. And I think that that's one of the things that changed, is that the American, I often say that America's chief export was family therapy. And so there were all these people who went around the world to train. That whole movement has certainly declined as countries have their own people who are trained and are teaching family therapy. But the other thing I would say about that is that with that growth came Bill was concerned about a kind of way of trying to both evaluate, excuse me, and build in cultural context with one eye, but have another eye towards what was necessary to get people up to speed to be good family therapists. And I think that is one of his one of the things that I would remember him as his own sort of double issue of being concerned about both of those simultaneously. I think that Bill had an enormous following, really, when we would go to international conferences. I was always amazed at the people who would come up and knew him from his writings, knew him
Mm.
from editing. And so there was a whole body of people, a group of people whose knowledge of Bill was from that vein. And at the same time, there were others of us who were more involved in the workings of the organization that knew a different part of Bill.
It
So
seems like everywhere he went, he left a legacy.
well, he's a person who I said will say will be greatly missed because he certainly had IFTA in his heart and was very concerned that the organization grow and continue to serve its purpose of bringing people together who are interested in working with families. So it'll be sad to not have him part of it. I last visited with him 3 years ago this summer when he celebrated his 90th birthday.
Mm.
I went down to Georgia and spent the afternoon at his 90th birthday, and still very interested in everything that was going on. And he was a man full of questions. If I called, he always had several things he wanted to know. So that's Bill Nichols.
Thank you very much for sharing. This is a
Welcome.
wonderful insight into someone that so many of us didn't get to meet in person, and if we did get interactions, they were often through his writing. So thank you for helping humanize and understand more of his whole person.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, Bill, and I will see you around.